Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Can you hear me okay in the back row? Rebels in the back, can you hear me? Their hands are up. That means they're the rebels. If you are attending for a class, make sure you see your instructor and you can sign in accordingly. The sign in for my class is circulating. All right, thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Sue Collins, and I am a co-director, co-PI of this project, Bad Info, Fake News, Manipulated Photographs, and Social Media Influencers. And first thing I need to mention is that this project is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So as many of you know, this is our last speaker for this event over the course of the academic year. So we're really happy to have you here, and we're really excited about the speaker tonight. But before we start, I'd like to take a moment on behalf of my co-PI and director partner, Stefka Hirostova. I'd like to thank a few people. Of course, I'd like to thank the Michigan Humanities, also the Department of Humanities, in particular, our chair, Scott Murata, who helped fund this event, as well as our department administrators, Mo Anton and Katie Elenich, and also some students who helped us publicize doing the work of posters and the rest of it, putting around campus. And as well, Megan Happel and Katie Gerke, who helped us with our designs for our publicity. I'd also like to thank the J. Robert Van Pelt and John Ruanne Opie Library staff, Aaron Mattis in particular, Jen Sams over here on IT, on Zoom, Lindsay Hiltonen, Allison Neely, Doreen Schaefer, David Zay, David Holden, and John Schneider-Horn, Paul Raymond, and David Chard. Thank you, everyone, for helping us. It takes a lot of people to put these things together, and so we're really grateful for your time. So what I'd like to do next is to introduce to you the moderator for tonight, who will also introduce our special guest. So Joshua Vissers is with us tonight. Just a little quick story about Joshua. He moved to the Keweenaw Peninsula after earning his BA in multimedia journalism from Grand State University. He came up here and he worked for the Daily Mining Gazette for a while. And in early 2020, he began to launch the Copper Beacon on Substack, right? Which is a reader-centric news source, which he was able to do in 1 year. The Copper Beacon is an alternative, self-sustaining community news source that works to educate students and adults alike in news interpretation and creation. Josh also works with the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism on the production of their 2 podcasts, Waterless and Transparency Talks. Josh's vision is to rebuild local journalism from the ground up. So please join me in a warm welcome for Josh Vissers.
Thank you very much, Sue. All right, so yes, I'm Josh Vissers, and it is very much my privilege to introduce you to Craig Silverman this evening. I can tell you that I've read many of his stories. When they're published, they tend to make a splash. He is a new kind of journalist for the misinformation age. I've got a few notes on some of the stories that might ring a bell here. He was formerly the media editor and also the leader of the Canadian division of BuzzFeed News. And there he published a few headlines here like, "I have blood on my hands. A whistleblower says Facebook ignored global political manipulation." This story, combined with a few others on Facebook, actually won a George Polk Award in journalism for Mr. Silverman. And this one in particular was reporting done on a lengthy internal memo from a Facebook data scientist who was denouncing some of their practices, particularly in ignoring the manipulation on the platform from some bad actors. Another one that really stood out to me in 2016 was how teens in the Balkans are duping Trump supporters with fake news. This unveiled more than 100 websites, pro-Trump websites that were being run by teenagers in Macedonia, basically just for the money. And yet another one from BuzzFeed, "This is how your hyper-partisan political news gets made." A very interesting investigation where they showed that several hyper-partisan political news websites were basically, even though they were on opposite sides of the political spectrum, we're running essentially the same stories with slightly different headlines and cut lines and a few different words just to change the bias a little bit, running them on multiple websites, targeting different audiences, and ultimately just selling outrage. Silverman has also founded the website emergent.info, which tracks rumors that have been reported in the news and determines whether or not they end up being true or not, or whether they're ever confirmed one way or the other at all. More recently, Craig Silverman has joined the team at ProPublica, where he has continued to scrutinize big tech and their role in global politics. Recently, he co-published an article about pro-Russian propaganda, war propaganda, that seems to be stemming from a known Russian troll farm. Silverman is also the author of 3 books, one called Mafia Boy, which he co-authored with the subject of the book, Michael Calce. Calce carried out a series of cyber attacks in February of 2000 that took down a lot of big websites, including Yahoo. Don't remember any others off the top of my head, but that ended up in President Bill Clinton at the time calling a summit and actually starting to take cybersecurity seriously. Other book is Lies, Damn Lies, and Viral Content, which is an in-depth report on how online media often promote misinformation in order to drive engagement. And the award-winning and dear to my heart, Regret the Error, How Media Mistakes Pollute the Press and Imperil Free Speech. This book was based on a blog of the same name, and it highlights a lot of serious and impactful errors that happened in the press over centuries. And last but not least, Silverman has also repeatedly edited the Verification Handbook for Disinformation and Media Manipulation, which is available for free on his website, craigsilverman.ca. Without further ado, I pass you over to Craig Silverman.
I'm trying to clear the screen for you, Craig, because there's a whole bunch of stuff on there. So as soon as we get that off there, we'll have you full screen.
We don't have audio.
And here.
Hold on. I think you're muted. No, I think we got to turn it off. You tested.
You're welcome to help yourself to food here. I put out some more plates in case you had to get some of there weren't any plates.
This is a tech college. There's someone in this room that knows how to fix this.
I'm 3 miles outside of the radius.
I want to say I'm like 66 miles.
Where are you from? Oh, cool. So,
I truthfully don't.
good one now.
Still not working.
I was sure. Also, the game had 41.
Oh, we can hear Craig at home.
The
Try has himself muted. Does he have the right output like headphones?
And then they have fabrication, and that's tried to record. Like 2 miles up the road. So on past Yeah, I mean, you can't miss it. It's like a big building, fire trucks.
No, I grew up in Detroit.
Driving 41.
Sorry.
No, what was that?
Oh.
Yeah, I know. I did.
Yeah, I went to.
Testing, testing. Can anyone? Oh, looks like it's coming through. Oh, I see some thumbs up. I see some people clapping. All right, I'm just gonna leave now. I got applause. That's it. That's all I need. All right, so I think we're good to go. I'll just watch in the chat just to see if anybody says I need to stop again. But I think they figured everything out, and it's great to be here with all of you. And thank you for the introduction. And great, we're ready to get started. So look, it's a thrill to be able to come and talk about this topic with all of you. I'm also looking forward to the discussion at the end. So I want to go through kind of a few key things. One of them is sort of talking a little bit about how I ended up on this particular beat, which wasn't really a beat that newsrooms had until relatively recently. And also to talk about sort of the broader context of, you know, why suddenly there are journalists out there with the title of disinformation reporter. And also this information environment that has kind of created a scenario where this is now something you're seeing more and more in newsrooms, and what kind of the toll of disinformation has been a little bit on journalists as well. And so, as I say, I'm you know, eager to get started and talk you through a little bit about, you know, my experience on it, but also to then take some questions and discussion. So let me share my screen, and please flag me in the chat if my screen isn't being shared. But I want to start a little bit with something that Josh in the introduction talks a little bit about, which is, you know, a town in what is now a country called North Macedonia. So I actually got to visit this country. It's a small country in the Balkans. And I went there several years ago and got kind of a tour from some local journalists. And they brought me up and they said, you know, the best place to see this town, the town of Elis, is if you come to the top of this kind of mountain nearby. And so I could see the town, and we were sort of talking about it. We were talking about how, you know, this factory here that we could see in the distance used to be the main employer in this town. And it was a factory, and, you know, they were producing the product. And it was going well until some local journalists actually did some reporting to show that the pollution coming from it was, you know, was harming the water supply, was causing a lot of, you know, dangerous fumes and things to be blown onto the town by the wind, and was dumping a lot of kind of toxic material. And I said, oh, you know, where was the toxic material being dumped? And they said, well, you're standing on it. You're standing on a toxic mountain that was created from all of the toxic stuff coming out of the factory. And you can sort of see in the front bottom part of the photo there, this sort of black, you know, soot and ash. That's what we were standing on. And that was the toxic waste from the factory. And so, you know, kudos to these local journalists who wrote about the town's main employer and how it was poisoning people. And that actually led to the factory being shut down, which is, you know, a good result of good investigative journalism. But of course, you know, there are unintended consequences to things at times. And in this case, you know, there was people really went looking for work, and the town has really never, you know, recovered from that. And so what started happening in about 2014 was that young people in this town started figuring out a way to make money from the internet. And what they were doing was they were launching websites about, you know, specific niche topics like motorcycles and sports cars. And they were launching them in English, because that's where, if you got a big audience from Facebook in English and you had ads on the website, you could earn a lot of money. And they were earning far more money than their parents had ever made working at that factory. They were earning so much, in fact, they were buying brand new cars and other things. And by the time we got around to the 2016 US election, they realized that there was a new opportunity, which was publishing things about American politics. And so these are some of the stories that these websites, we found more than 100 of them, English language websites being run out of Velez, North Macedonia. And what we saw was that almost all of them were kind of, supporting Trump or attacking Clinton. So they had the same kind of partisan bent. And when I did a kind of examination to see which ones actually were getting the most engagement on Facebook, I was shocked because some of them were getting hundreds of thousands of likes and shares and comments. In some cases, I think there was a couple that maybe over 1 million. And the stories that performed best were the stories that were 100% false, like these ones. And so after I sort of did that, I got in touch with some of the people running these sites. And one of them kind of memorably told me that, I asked them, do they know that these stories are false? And are they making them up? And he said, well, sometimes they're made up, but a lot of times they're just copying ones they've seen elsewhere. But these guys in Macedonia were really good at marketing their content on Facebook, getting it in front of the right people, running ads to promote it, building an audience, and getting lots of visitors and traffic, which then earned them, money to go buy brand new sports cars. And he said, yes, the info in the blogs is bad, it's false and misleading, but the rationale is that if it gets the people to click on it, engage, then use it. They didn't care who won the 2016 election. They weren't Trump supporters. All they wanted to do was find the content that performed best on Facebook and earn them the most ad revenue. And this story, which we ended up publishing, we published this a week before Election Day in 2016 at a time when pretty much, everybody, all the elites, all the pollsters, everybody said that, Trump wasn't going to win, right? Everybody in the media pretty much believed Trump wasn't going to win. And this story, it got a bit of traction at the time, but then after Trump won, it started getting a lot of traction because people inaccurately started to think, well, this is the reason that Trump won. It's because there was a bunch of false stories out there and people got fooled, and that's why they voted for Trump. And to me, that, that doesn't explain why Trump won. There's lots of reasons, complicated reasons why he won. But what it does explain really well, this story, I think, is, some of the challenges in our information environment. And some of the, the explanations of why it may feel like there is so much false and misleading content spreading. And, when I think about what some of these characteristics are that this story, I think, kind of revealed is, one, these guys in Macedonia, they understood that the more people they could get, to like their content on Facebook, the more that Facebook's own systems would say, hey, this content is popular with these people, maybe I should show it to more people. I'm sure you've heard of the algorithms that Facebook and other platforms use to decide which content to show to which people. People heavily engaging with a piece of content probably means that these systems are going to show it to more people. And the guys in Macedonia realized that if they figured out which things got the most likes and the most shares and just fed more of that on Facebook, they would be able to win. They would be able to get Facebook itself to promote their content to more and more people. And of course, the content itself was, in some of the most successful stuff, totally made up, totally false. And this is also a characteristic of our information environment. There is a huge amount of fakeness, of trolling, of, attacking people, harassing people. And there's also a huge amount of criminality. There are scams and fraud. Last year was probably the worst year for cybercrime and scams since the FBI and other US agencies have ever been tracking this on the internet. It is getting completely out of control. And the people who are often winning are the folks who understand how these platforms like Facebook and others work and how to manipulate them so that they win. And one of the things that they understand, that the Macedonian guys understood, is that oftentimes the more extreme your content is, the more extreme your claim, the more likely it is to stand out in what is an information saturated environment, where there is tons of content, tons of things being published by media, by regular folks and that. How do you stand out? Well, you get more extreme and you get a little more false or more misleading. And that sort of starts to stand out a little bit. And what we've seen also is, the lessons, these things, that I've just detailed, these have been learned by authoritarian regimes and governments around the world and by extremists, white supremacists and anti-government extremists and other types of extremists that are out there. They use it to recruit people. They use it to get to suppress journalists, to suppress opposition parties. And they've been able to weaponize these platforms in ways that are very concerning for free speech and for a free press. And so when you put all of these things together, it means a lot for a lot of different elements of society. But tonight, obviously, we're a little more focused on what that means for newsrooms and journalists. And for me, it really meant that we have to reconsider some of the ways that we do decision making in newsrooms and how we choose to cover things or choose to cover other things, and how journalists actually go about doing our jobs. Because while I'm kind of a specialist in this area, the reality is that there is false and misleading information about any topic. There are people trying to manipulate and troll across any topic that is out there. You name anything, and it's probably being touched in some way by this. And so every journalist has to kind of understand these dynamics and be able to adapt to them and do reporting that illuminates rather than is simply propagating things that are false or misleading. And that's where I want to sort of talk about a little bit more about these dynamics and the nature of mis and disinformation, because if you're going to cover it, if you're going to report on it, you obviously need to understand these areas. And this is a kind of niche area that prior to 2016, the end of 2016, most people weren't really thinking about, most journalists weren't thinking about, most researchers weren't thinking about. I've been doing this for more than a decade, which makes me a bit of a weirdo in that sense, because there was, I could probably count the people on two hands that were actively engaged in this stuff, particularly in the US prior to the end of 2016. And so when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, this is what I mean. These are two definitions here from an organization called First Draft, which does a lot of training and research in this area. Misinformation is really, the difference is really about intent. Misinformation is false or misleading information that's being shared or spread by people who don't realize that it is false or misleading. These are well-meaning people who are often passing along a piece of information they heard because they think someone should know it, because they think maybe, in the moment of a natural disaster, a hurricane or a tornado, it's information that maybe other people, their neighbors, need to hear to know where to go to be safe. Whereas disinformation, people are creating and spreading it and knowingly doing so. And there are a variety of reasons. There could be sort of partisan, political reasons. It could be done for profit, which, our friends in Macedonia were doing. And there are also people who just kind of like to cause chaos and like to sort of fool people and get enjoyment out of that. And so that's sort of, the distinguishing thing between the two of them. And one of the other things to understand is that there are lots of different types of false and misleading content out there. And this, for journalists, is something that we need to appreciate and understand. It's not all the same. It can take on different characteristics at different times. And this is a little kind of chart showing some of the different ones that are out there. If we think about what the guys in Macedonia were spreading, it fits in that category on the right there, fabricated content. It was 100% false. It was made to deceive. In this case, they were doing it for a financial motivation. But the most common type of mis or disinformation that we see is the one in the bottom middle there, which is labeled false context. So this is when genuine content is shared with false contextual information. So let's say, there's a war going on right now in Ukraine. A lot of times you will see videos. In fact, today, a major Russian warship sunk off the waters of Ukraine, and when it was reported that it had been hit by some missiles from Ukraine, which Ukraine seems to be what Ukraine is claiming. Russia is claiming something different. There's more evidence, I'd say, at this point supporting the Ukrainian claim. There were a lot of videos circulating showing a warship exploding in a body of water. But this was actually a video that was several years old and was showing the Norwegian Navy blowing up one of its own ships that it was, decommissioning. And so this was an old video, but that people were resharing on Twitter and other places saying, hey, this is the Russian warship being hit by the missiles from Ukraine. And a lot of people reshared it and thought it was true. It's a real video, but it doesn't show what people claimed that it was showing. And that sort of goes to this point from the most recent edition of our verification handbook, which is free, and I'll give you a link at the end if you want to read more from one of the authors of a chapter here, Claire Wardle. She talks. The fact is that content that is deceptive is not pretending to be news. So I have this sort of fake news sign here next to me because it's a term that I started using a long time ago, and of course it doesn't mean what I used to use it to mean. It's sort of been co-opted in many ways. But it's often not pretending to be news. It's often, images or memes or certain activity on social media. And most importantly, it's often not 100% false like those stories from Macedonia. It's usually misleading, or that kind of video, like I just explained, that's been used out of context. And the other core thing that is really important to understand is that, you know, we play a role in all of this. And this is something that is really important as a journalist to kind of recognize in yourself, is that we are all subject to our own bias. We all have our own views. They can you know, affect the way that we process and interpret information. And, you know, particularly if we have deeply held views, we are less likely to sort of give those up in the face of new information. And so there is a human aspect to all of this. And when journalists go about doing our work, if we do not recognize our own biases and control for those in the way that, you know, we best can, then of course we fall victim to them and can do really, you know, unfair and inaccurate coverage. And, you know, but it's also something that people can exploit. And so this is an example here. On the left, you see, you know, an article from a liberal website, you know, about Kellyanne Conway being fired, which never happened. And you can see that their tilt on it is, aren't you glad that they got rid of her? And then the conservative site says, oh, you're going to be so angry that they just got rid of Kellyanne Conway, right? And, you know, this is the kind of thing you can see where the same piece of news, in this case, a completely false claim, you just simply have to spin it one way or another. And when I looked at these two articles, I realized that they maybe had a couple dozen words different between the two of them. To tilt it one way or to tilt it the other, that's all it took. And in the end, it turned out that these websites were in fact owned by the same people. And they had a network of sites on the left and a network of sites on the right. And this story came out in, I believe it was 2017. And within a couple of years after that, I had actually found more than half a dozen people, publishers, who were playing both sides off against each other. They were, you know, firing people up on the right, firing people up on the left, and they were appealing to the biases that were there. And this is something that affects all of us. You know, humans are quick to develop an irrational loyalty to our beliefs. And so we work hard to find evidence that supports those opinions. We love stuff that confirms what we already think. But it's not just that. We also will discount, discredit, or avoid information that does not go along with our beliefs. And this is something that, you know, journalists have to self-diagnose and think about all the time as we're doing our work. And so when we're doing disinformation reporting and debunking, which I'll talk about more in depth, you know, we have to be aware and control for our own biases. And as I mentioned before, you know, our media environment, it's wonderfully democratized in the sense that it's very easy for anyone to throw up a website or post on social media and get your views out and potentially build an audience. But that openness is also something that can be exploited. And, you know, it's exploited in a lot of different ways. But, you know, one of them is just, you know, it's very simple to make things seem more popular, or make an individual or a piece of content seem more popular than it is. You can buy friends, you can buy followers, you can buy views for your YouTube video. And those platforms certainly try to combat this stuff. But one of the reasons why journalists need to be educated about all of this is because we can easily fall for something. We can see, wow, you know, this YouTube video's got 5 million views. It must really be striking a chord. Maybe we should write about it. But maybe that person bought, you know, 4.5 million of those views. And if we don't understand that, and we don't understand the mechanics and the way that this environment can be manipulated, then we as journalists can be very easily manipulated, just as members of the public can be. And it's not just about, you know, false or misleading content, or about, you know, fake social media engagement. It really pervades so many elements of the digital economy and information space. You know, one example is just, you know, if you look at the reviews on Amazon and you make your purchasing decisions based on that, you should be aware that there are lots of cases where people are being compensated to give positive reviews on Amazon. And Amazon recently removed about half a dozen major Chinese technology companies because they had huge, you know, compensated review rings. The reviews you saw were not really from people who genuinely bought a product and gave an honest review. And this is happening on an absolutely global scale. And I think this is something now that is not as hard for me to communicate to people, because we've all been living through this pandemic where we've seen, you know, a huge amount of false and misleading stuff, and realized that the world, many parts of the world, are having a shared experience with dealing with this virus. And it has led claims to, you know, jump from one country to the next, and to do so sometimes in a matter of hours or days. These two examples here, these were gathered by what's called the Coronavirus Facts Alliance, which is a network of fact checkers around the world who were starting to kind of collect the things that they were fact checking about coronavirus very early on. And they could see that, something that started in Taiwan within, hours or days was in South Korea and then made its way to Europe and beyond. And you can see that these green dots on these maps show the path and the places that these exact same claims went. And they hopped continents, they hopped languages, and you can see how this stuff spreads really quickly because of the speed and the frictionless environment of social media. And then the other thing, which is a big piece for journalists to try and understand, I'll give you an example of a story that I worked on in this area, is that disinformation has become basically a service. There are organizations out there around the world who describe themselves as public relations or marketing firms, and they have a menu of options of, oh, would you like us to create a bunch of fake accounts and spread negative claims about your opponent? We can absolutely do that. Would you like us to take your content and amplify it out through a network of pages or other accounts that we control and make them seem like they're all genuine supporters of yours? We can do that too. And so this is a big challenge. It's a challenge because the average person can see this stuff and think that it's genuine support. And it's a challenge for journalists because if we don't recognize that these are campaigns, if these are information and manipulation operations, we end up covering them like they're genuine. And we end up giving them that kind of seal of approval that, oh, now mainstream media or local media or whoever is writing about this and treating it like it's real. That basically launders it and makes it seem like a very credible thing. And so let me give you an example of what this looks like. So I was collaborating with a researcher at the Digital Africa Research Lab. And she's originally from Nigeria, and she had noticed, Twitter's pretty popular in Nigeria. There's a lot of people with like millions of followers there. It's a very active community. She had noticed that a lot of people, including some very big accounts, were all tweeting about in support of this guy named Alex Saab. Now, I won't go into huge detail on who he is, but he's a Colombian businessman who has done work with the Venezuelan regime and who was charged with money laundering by the US. And at one point, Alex Saab was traveling on a plane on his way to Iran from South America. And he made a stop in Cape Verde in Africa, and his plane was detained. He was detained, and he's basically being held there for extradition to the United States. And so suddenly, out of nowhere, about a year ago, a bunch of Nigerian influencers started tweeting about the plight of Alex Saab, free Alex Saab. And they used the same hashtag. They were tagging the same Twitter accounts, as you can see in these sample tweets. And it's strange that suddenly people in Nigeria would care about a Colombian businessman who's, waiting to see if he will be extradited to the US. And so as we started looking and gathering these tweets, we could look at the hashtag, we could see the accounts talking about it, we could look at their bios, we could see that a lot of them were tagging the same accounts. In some cases, there's this @Fernand47588665 account, which had only been set up like a couple of weeks before and had almost no followers and was just out of nowhere suddenly being tagged in all these tweets. This was, very suspicious behavior, the kind of stuff that we look for when we're examining social media. We look for patterns and connections and suspicious coordinated behavior. And we even saw this woman, Tonto Dike, who's like a famous Nigerian influencer. She said she was going to give them some money if you added the free Alex Saab hashtag to your replies. And so she ended up, trying to delete these tweets later, but we had screen capped them. And there was another guy here with his account named Dr. Pam Pam. He was asking people to sign a petition, and he was also telling people to, preparing to engage with his next post. He also offered some compensation. So we could see networks of kind of influencers, people with big accounts in Nigeria, promoting this hashtag out of nowhere, getting people to sign petitions, offering to pay people to tweet the hashtag. And through talking to some of these folks and trying to get them to talk to us, we ended up finding out that they were being paid to do this. They were being paid to tweet. It was a campaign. And we actually ended up getting a copy of the contract. So this is a case where this kind of reporting, ideally, you are doing your digital analysis work. You are looking for signals and identifying things that are worth digging more into, but you are also, doing traditional reporting, of trying to develop sources, of trying to get documents and other things. And what we could see on the left there was, they were expected to make 2 posts a week for 1 month. They told them which hashtag to use. They told them, which, if anyone, asked for more information, to redirect them to an account called Wakandanomics. And they expected them to tag that Ferdinand account to aid with monitoring. So that was a way that they were monitoring the account, monitoring that these influencers were doing it. And it said, the terms, they would pay them 50% before the campaign and 50% when it was done. And fortunately for us, we could see that the document came from an organization called Digital Good Governance for Africa. So, the right-hand side is sort of, the headline of the story that I ended up writing. And this is, a small case study. I'm going to give you another one in a second of what this kind of work looks like. But the interesting side note to all of this is, not too long ago, about a month ago, there was a court document in the US unsealed where the Department of Justice actually says, because this extradition case is still going on, where the Department of Justice actually revealed that Alex Sepp has been an informant for the Department of Justice. And so they were extraditing him to bring him to the US to testify, to sort of complete this agreement that they had with him. And so in the end, this campaign was, for a guy who was actually apparently quite happy to be extradited, because he had been working with the Department of Justice all along. And so, so the people who did this kind of wasted their money in the end. And then, the last point here is that, governments and others do use false and misleading information to target journalists, to try and undermine legitimate journalistic work. And they also want to waste the attention of journalists. They want to get us to focus on things that are not true, that are not real, rather than actually, doing the work that we should be doing. And let me show you what this kind of looks like. So these are some tweets here that were sent, and there were just hundreds and thousands of these tweets sent attacking an Ecuadorian journalist named Martha Roldos. And this was done, years ago. This was back in 2014. So as much as this all feels kind of new, there have been governments and other people engaging in this stuff long before, I think, the moment of Trump and other things woke people up to this. And, so she was the subject of a really horrible harassment campaign. People tweeting at her en masse, people, calling for her to be jailed. She basically couldn't use Twitter because her mentions were all the time just filled with, horrible, vile stuff. And these were people that were affiliated with the government at the time. The government was kind of running a state-sponsored trolling operation to try and silence this journalist. And we have seen that continue and really continue to grow in sophistication since then, as a way of silencing journalists and a way of discrediting their work. We've also seen, starting in about 2017, a lot of authoritarian countries around the world, or authoritarian leaning countries around the world, pass so-called fake news laws, laws that are supposed to restrict, false, misleading, damaging information from spreading. But in most cases, what these laws are actually doing is they're in effect outlawing real journalism, and they're often outlawing the political opposition. So these laws have been passed in a lot of different countries around the world. And they're being used absolutely to put people in jail. And just the accusation, the claim of fake news is something that you see a lot of authoritarian leaders talking about, saying, this story about me or about my regime is fake news. It's made up by journalists. And so this has something, the awareness of the existence of disinformation is something that is now being weaponized back against journalists. And this isn't to say that journalists do perfect work. We never make mistakes. I'm going to talk in a second about how I actually spent a decade focused on the mistakes that journalists were making. But the reality is that there was a lot of really disingenuous and bad faith claims of this nature meant to undermine legitimate reporting. And then there's that sort of time wasting piece here, the final one. This is a quote from a guy who went by the name Microchip. And Microchip, he's a sort of far right extremist based in the US. He is pseudonymous. I don't know his real name. He, during 2016, ran a lot of automated accounts on Twitter. And most of them were used to support Trump. That's who he supported in the election. But he also just liked to use them to, harass people and sort of cause chaos on Twitter with. And at one point, he had a comment, which I thought was really telling, which is, he was talking about how he would use his accounts to try and, stir up controversy, stir up things. And the hope was to trigger new, what he calls mainstream media journalists to cover, because they buy the meme. So make it seem like there is a real movement, like make it seem like there is a real claim that's circulating. And his term, that's, buy the meme, buy these sort of claim that is going viral. And he said, they should have already figured this out and stopped covering us. And so one of the realizations that I think a lot of newsrooms have had to come to is that, we have to decide, we have to have a high bar of what we're covering in this digital environment, because we are being manipulated, we are being targeted. And if we cover something and treat it like it, what it appears to be, and don't realize that there's several layers to it and that it's a manipulation campaign, then we've basically given the bad actors exactly what they want. And here is a bad actor saying, man, you guys need to stop covering this stuff. And so this is a new consideration that a lot of newsrooms have to have. There's always been people trying to get coverage, always been people trying to manipulate journalists. But in the digital realm, the attempts of manipulation and the ways that manipulation can occur are new to a lot of journalists and new to a lot of newsrooms. And they often fall for it, is the unfortunate reality. And so this is why, starting again, late 2016, that a lot of newsrooms suddenly realized, wait a second, this coverage of disinformation is important. This manipulation of the information environment is important. And it's something that we should be covering and be aware of. And so the response that we have seen, over the last 6 or so years, I guess, is the emergence of the so-called disinformation beat, and certainly the growth of fact checking. Now, here's kind of like my personal origins for this, because as I said, I've been doing this kind of reporting now for a little more than a decade, which is considered pretty long in this area. And as you heard in the introduction, I started very early on, with this blog called Regret the Error in 2004. So that's how old I am. I was a blogger back in the day. I was working as a freelance journalist in Canada, where I'm based. And I just started this blog because I was interested in the fact that journalists talk a lot about the importance of accuracy, but you don't read a lot about it. And you don't see journalists actually, sharing their techniques and approaches. And so I started this website to actually track the mistakes that journalists were making, to talk about how we verify information and fact check information, and to really try and make this be something that we put even more focus on. And I ran this, I basically did this for about a decade. I stopped writing this blog. It had moved to another organization at a certain point in about early 2014, which coincided with some other stuff I was working on at the time related to disinformation. But I also was pretty much the only journalist in the world tracking incidents of plagiarism and fabrication in journalism. And so accountability of journalism has always been really important to me, and acknowledging our mistakes has always been really important to me. And I wrote an entire book about that stuff. But it's, what started to change for me was in about 2010, social media became a really big force. And I realized that all the effort and interest I had in how journalists were verifying information and fact-checking stuff in newsrooms, it was a very different dynamic, because all of a sudden the information was public. There was stuff circulating on Twitter and Facebook and other places. And journalists now had to figure out, whether this tweet that somebody had sent with a photo that seemed very newsworthy and interesting was actually true or not, and figure out, what was real and what was fake circulating in this environment. And in 2014, we published the first edition of the Verification Handbook, which was the first time that anybody had actually written a book about how to do these new types of verification skills, how to take a video on YouTube and geolocate where it is in Syria to determine who might have been the one dropping the bombs, how to analyze a social media account, how to analyze social media conversations, how to dig into web content and understand where it's coming from. This was, published for free in early 2014. And we've done a couple editions since. And this was a book where, we had a handful of contributors, because those were the only people doing this at the time. This was a very, very niche skill, and most newsrooms didn't consider it something that was important at the time. And so this is early 2014. And 2014 ends up being a really important time. There's a war in Ukraine right now, but there's been a war in Ukraine since 2014. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and other parts of the country. And, we have seen disinformation campaigns targeting Ukraine, targeting Russian language speakers in Ukraine, targeting the global community about what Russia was doing or not doing. I mean, Russia invaded and for months insisted it didn't have any troops there, even though people like me and others who were paying attention could see that Russian troops were literally geotagging their posts on Instagram that they were in Crimea. And so, you know, the dissonance between the official government line and what you could actually see soldiers posting on Instagram was very different. And that same year was the year that Malaysian flights MH17 was shot down over Eastern Ukraine. And this is where people like Elliot Higgins, who you see cited here, started to really dig in and analyze who was responsible for shooting this down. Russia said it was Ukraine. Ukraine said it was Russian-backed rebels in these disputed territories. And, you know, just to give you an idea of the kind of information that the Russian government was putting out at the time, I mean, they claimed at one point that, you know, well, it was clearly shot down by Ukraine because there's this satellite photo of the flight and it's, you know, in a part of Ukraine where only a Ukrainian missile could have shot it down. You know, but unfortunately, as you see in this tweet here, you know, that couldn't have been the plane because that's not where the logo on Malaysian airline flights are. And so this is the kind of verification work that has started to emerge as more of a practice in journalism and also among human rights researchers and others, where you are analyzing images, you are analyzing video, you are analyzing social media activity, and you are trying to compare and contrast and understand what's really going on. And 2014 was a time where these skills started to really grow and be recognized. 2014 was also the year I was doing a research project tracking viral rumors and trying to figure out best practices for debunking and verifying them. And we launched a website called Emergent, where we would find a claim that was circulating on news websites and then try to figure out over time, did it turn out to be true or false? And, you know, who got it right, who got it wrong? And how were news outlets covering this kind of emerging information that in its early phases was neither true nor false? It was also the year where, you know, the Washington Post had a regular column called What Was Fake on the Internet This Week. There was a Ukrainian organization called Stop Fake that launched in response to the disinformation around the war in Ukraine. And Snopes, the longtime rumor checker, started to really spend more time on stuff that was spreading, you know, on the web and what have you, as opposed to claims that were coming in to them tips by email. And so this is, to me, the early 2014 is the critical year where this idea of disinformation reporting is starting to percolate, but mostly it's still called fact checking or debunking at that point in time. And this is the year I was doing this research project. And when I started to actually use the term fake news, this is why I have this thing over here, because I guess I'm a little old school in having used it. This is the report I ended up publishing in early 2015 based on the research and all the data we gathered in 2014. And I wrote about these sites that I came across, which were 100%, you know, they looked like news websites. They had articles, they had bylines, they had, you know, reporter bios, but everything on the site was 100% false. And they looked like news websites, they produced content like it, but they had ads on the site, and the goal was to basically trick people into sharing their stuff on Facebook, so it got them lots of traffic and earned them money. Not unlike the Macedonian teens and young men. And so I started using this term to describe this 100% false, you know, deceptive, made to look like news and there to earn money. I started calling these fake news websites. And, you know, my conclusion to that report was that newsrooms were not doing a good job of tracking and debunking false, misleading information. They didn't know how to they weren't paying attention to verifying stuff. They were at times actually making the problem worse by propagating ridiculous viral claims. You know, the debunking programs that I found were scattershot. They didn't use best practices. And I wrote that, you know, the news media was more a part of the problem of online misinformation than they are the solution. And so that came out in early 2015. And that to me was the state of things, where you had lots of people chasing viral traffic in newsrooms, things that would get, you know, do well on Facebook, perform well, and they weren't thinking about verification. And these skills were not widely dispersed in newsrooms. And to be honest with you, they're still not all that widely dispersed today. I do trainings all the time for newsrooms, and there's still a lot for people to learn. And then, of course, what changes? You know, the 2016 election, but people, you know, inevitably focus a lot on the US election, right? And at a certain point, Trump takes over the term fake news, uses it to describe the media. But 2016 wasn't just about the US election. There was also the election in the Philippines earlier in the year where Duterte was elected, and he had a massive Facebook manipulation operation going
harassing and spreading false claims about opponents, attacking journalists. It was a preview of the kind of well-orchestrated campaign that we see other governments and people using. And also it was the year of the Brexit campaign where, there was a lot of misleading and false information spreading. And it confused a lot of people. And I would never say that false information sort of led to the Brexit result, just like I wouldn't say that false information got Trump elected. But these things were out there and they were factors. And there's no question, certain people were interacting with them. And so 2016 happens, and suddenly there's this awakening, right? There were seeds of it a little bit with this organization Bellingcat, which was doing really great advanced verification and geolocation work. There was Stop Fake in Ukraine, trying to get good information out during a war. There was Snopes, there was Emergent, the project I had run. But 2016 happens, and all of a sudden, everybody cares about this stuff, and every newsroom is trying to figure out how we cover the abuse and the manipulation of the information environment. And so here's what happened. One, at the end of 2016, Facebook announced that it would be working with what it calls third-party fact checkers. So, fact-checking organizations, which to that point were primarily focused on checking the statements of politicians and public figures. Facebook now starts paying them to say, hey, we will give you access to a feed of viral stuff that's spreading on Facebook. And if you see stuff that's 100% false and you can fact check it and show that it's false, we want you to tell us that so that we can label it and make sure it doesn't spread anymore. And so what happened, basically in 4 years' time, suddenly there's, from that point onward, with Facebook suddenly funding fact checking, there's more than 300 fact checkers as of the end of 2020. So 4 years' time, it goes from what I think was maybe a few dozen, if I recall correctly, in 2016, small number. All of a sudden we're at more than 300. And this is, a map showing you where they are. And so Facebook today is one of the largest funders of fact checking anywhere, because they have this platform where there's a huge amount of false and misleading information. And, they want this signal from qualified journalists and fact checkers to tell them if something is false, so that Facebook, typically they don't remove it, so that they can label it, so that people see the warning and can read the fact check. And also so that Facebook reduces its spreads, takes it out of the amplification system by its algorithms. And so we've had an explosion in fact checking and in disinformation reporting since then. And I mentioned Bellingcat, they do amazing investigations in this area. The New York Times and the Washington Post now have visual investigations teams who can do really advanced work analyzing video, and in some cases creating 3D models to actually, see what happens in a war zone, at a shooting, that kind of thing. And we see news organizations around the world trying to dig in and expose manipulation. And so, I'd summarize sort of where we are now with this by saying, we have more fact checkers and disinformation reporters than have ever existed. But as I said before, the reality is still very niche. And most journalists do not sort of know a lot of this contextual information about the information environment that I've gone through here with you, and do not also necessarily have the skills to do basic kind of investigative work on it, which is something I'm trying to change by offering a lot of trainings. Suddenly we have platforms like Facebook and TikTok and others who are paying fact checkers to help them to surface content for them that needs to be labeled or removed. But of course, there's conflicts of interest. I mean, taking Facebook's money is a real choice. Facebook doesn't tell fact checkers what to check, but I've reported on examples where Facebook has actually kind of chosen not to act on certain fact checks that seem inconvenient for Facebook. And Facebook also, because it is so big and there's so much garbage on it, they incentivize volume. So they want fact checkers fact checking as many things as possible, and they will often pay them more for fact checking more stuff. And that creates perhaps a negative incentive to kind of fact check as many things, whether or not people have seen them or not. There is a huge amount of inequality in terms of, a lot of money has flowed to the US and Western Europe and parts of North America, but you look at other parts of the world, it's just not the same. So it's an unequal scenario. An encouraging thing is that there are organizations now often building tools for fact checkers and disinformation reporters to use. And I cite a few there that you can sort of check out. There's one called InVid We Verify, which is a fantastic free browser plugin for verifying photos and videos. And there's another called Hoaxy for analyzing the spread of stuff on Twitter. And I'm very concerned that
when you have an explosion of people in an area in journalism, it becomes a hot thing. The bar of the stories, the bar of what to cover and what to do starts to lower because everybody wants to get stories out. Journalists can sometimes have pack mentality, right? Where we are all trying to cover the same thing, write about the same topic, break a story. And sometimes that causes people to write about what I call, low quality so-called investigations, where, someone might come to them and say, hey, I've, found, here's a bunch of accounts and, they're being run by Russia. And if the journalist just takes it and runs with it without doing their own work, that can put false information out there. And then the other thing that's also happening is the rise of disinformation reporting and fact checking has also led governments and bad actors to actually launch their own kind of fake fact checking or debunking operations. And so a lot of governments around the world have launched their own sort of fact check programs. And sometimes they're 100% just putting false claims out through them. And so, that is going to just confuse the audience even more. It's like, well, this is a fact checker and that's a fact checker. How do I tell the difference? All right, so I want to show you quickly an example of kind of what this work looks like. And, I gave you the Nigeria example a little bit before, which was a case where we saw behavior on social media. We started to kind of dissect, what were they doing? What was consistent across them? What accounts were they tagging? Why are they using this hashtag? And we used that to go out and try to build sources and understand and get documents to know what really happened. And that was a case where we were able to point the finger and say, here is the organization responsible for this. They were paying these people. Here is how much they were being paid and that kind of thing. But a lot of times things are murky and we don't always get we can't tie a neat bow on it in the end. And so this is a case study where, I was able to get enough information to produce a story, but to this day, I don't know who was actually behind this thing that I found. And that's something that we face with a lot. And newsrooms are often not great at dealing with uncertainty and gray areas because we like to be able to say something very clearly, but nuance and this element of a gray area is something we have to deal with in this world. All right, so let me give you an example here. One of the things that I do, I try to sort of have ongoing monitoring going on, topics I'm interested in. I'm always sort of searching on Twitter. I'm looking for news articles. One of the things I also do is I look for ads that are running on Facebook or across other platforms. And so I was just curious one day, I decided to search for the keyword Xinjiang, which is the region in China where a lot of evidence has emerged, that the Muslim minority there have been, basically put in kind of re-education camps to, take away their religious identity and other elements of their culture and make them more sort of quote unquote Chinese in some ways. And there's been a lot of great reporting about this. The Chinese government denies that's what they're doing, but this is, a really hot topic. And so for me, I want to see what ads are running, because sometimes there's the news articles and there's the official statements from governments, but oftentimes people are buying ads to try and persuade people as well. And so I just happened one day to be searching using the keyword Xinjiang, and I came across this this ad on Facebook. And so it was a page named Globe Independent, and it was, basically about, it looked like a news article. Oh, the NBA cutting ties with China's Xinjiang region over its treatment of minorities. And it had a couple hashtags. So they were obviously kind of an anti-Chinese government approach here. And I had never heard of this website before. And I was interested. Okay, so they're running this ad. They're promoting their content. It's sort of anti-China content. Is this like a legitimate news organization or what is this? And so this is where the trail starts. I did a search because I was interested in the topic. I saw one thing that stood out to me because I wasn't familiar with it and it had a sort of a strong message. And so I wanted to understand more. And so I went and visited the Facebook page of the Globe Independent. And, in the About section, you can see there on the left, at the time I visited, they had 32,000 kind of likes and followers. I was like, oh, okay, that's like not huge, but it's not nothing. I could see that, they had a website, globe-independent.com. They had an email account. They described themselves as a media/news company. And I could also see that, the page at the time was relatively new. This was July 29th, 2020. You can see there in the middle, Facebook will tell you when a Facebook page is created. And what I saw on the Facebook page here was them sharing tons and tons of news articles, a lot of them with a strong sort of anti-Chinese government, pro-Uyghur bent. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, is this a real news organization and who runs it? And that's often a key question is like, well, who is behind this? Who is running this? I mean,
people can have their opinions about China and about Uyghurs, but the question is who is paying for this ad and who is paying for this news is a valid one, right? And so obviously from the page transparency piece, I could see when it was created, and then I can click on that. This is a tip for everyone just on Facebook pages. There's always this page transparency box. You can click on see all, and you will often get additional information. And so it's telling me, you see in the middle there, people who manage this page, it says 6 people from the United States, it's saying. So it's telling you that the people managing this page appear to be based in the US. And of course, it shows me that this page is currently running ads, and there's a button there to go to the ad library, and I could view all of the ads it was running. And oh, that's good. Let me learn what this page is paying to run. And here's a sample of the ads. And almost all of the ads were sort of anti-China, pro-Uyghur ads. And so I'm like, okay, that's interesting. This site has a real agenda on this, and they're paying money to promote these posts. And the other thing is that they're not just in English. If you can see here, some of them, and I had to, kind of Google to see what the language was, and it turned out it was Indonesian. So this is kind of weird, right? We have a website primarily in English, but publishing in English and Indonesian, strong anti-China bent, strong pro-Uyghur bent, buying ads, not being super clear about who's actually running it and who's behind it. And so, I visited the website, and on the left there, you can see they describe themselves as an independently owned and sourced digital daily news portal based in London. Okay, so they're saying they're based in London. But when I did a search, what's called a who is search, where you can see the registration records of a domain name, the domain for their website, I could see that, the organization listed there was the Seattle, Nevada Corporation in Nevada, US. And so there's a few conflicting signals here. Let's kind of recap those. Page managers appear to be based in the US, according to Facebook data. The website says it's an organization based in London. They're running ads and content in English and in Indonesian. That content has a strong pro-Uyghur, anti-China bent. But when I looked in the domain registration information, it's a US company. And then I contacted that company, which is like a defense contractor. They said they do not own this website. They have nothing to do with it. And they have no idea how their name got there. And one of the things to note is that on domain registration, like information like that, you can actually put a company name. There is no check or verification of that. You can put whoever's name you want there. And so I knew that was a weak signal. I knew that someone could put a fake company name there or a real company name that's unconnected there. And so what we know is that there is an element of deception happening here, right? Confusing signals between the US and London, confusing linguistic stuff, strong political bent, and actively deceptive information contained in the Whois record. And I had nothing that suggested that Seattle Navarro was involved in this. And so at this point, I sort of believed what they were saying and continued along that path. And I would have been happy to change my point of view on that if information came to light, but it never did. And here's the sort of last thing I want to note that I came across, which is that, when I looked at the content that was on the website, I was like, this is really professionally written and produced content. And yet there were no author names on the post. There's nobody claiming responsibility for this website. And so I just Googled some of the headlines that were on the site. And sure enough, I found that, basically all of the content that was on this website was plagiarized, stolen from news organizations around the world. In this example here, they stole an article from the Washington Post, right? And so they were looking for, pro-Uyghur, anti-China content, and they were copying and pasting it there. There was also someone producing stuff in Indonesian, which would suggest that at least somebody working for the news organization or this website spoke or read or knew Indonesian, right? And so in the end, I wasn't able to go any further. I wasn't able to uncover who exactly was behind it, but I did have enough to go to Facebook and say, what is going on here? You're accepting money from this organization that is deceptive about who it is. It's committing mass copyright violation. It's running political ads, and you haven't required them to register as a political advertiser, which is something that Facebook does. And I also went to Twitter because I found that they had a Twitter account that had already been suspended. And I asked Twitter, why did you suspend it? What's going on? Who are these people? And so here in the end is a story that I ran. We weren't able to say exactly who was behind it, but the sort of angle we took was that this is a bogus news site, but Facebook allowed it to spend who knows how much money, because Facebook wouldn't reveal,
to, to buy likes, to buy an audience, to grow their page to more than 32,000 fans, to run ads for their content promoting it. And, as we said in the story, it's unclear who was behind it. They didn't respond to any of my emails and Facebook messages. And they actually, after I reached out to them, they took the whole website offline, and Facebook removed the Facebook page after we asked about it. Facebook wouldn't say anything about who was behind it. They said that the only thing they told me was that their internal investigation found that the page was run by an inauthentic account, which is their term for fake or deceptive activity, but they wouldn't tell me where the account was based. They wouldn't tell me who was behind it, how much they spent on ads, nothing. And so, this is how the work sometimes shapes up. And so there's elements of frustration because I would have loved to know exactly who's behind it, to be able to say that. But you don't always get to that point. But we were still able to do a story that caused this deceptive operation to be removed and to remove itself. And it also, I think, shows some accountability of Facebook in particular of, how they do not have control over what's going on their platform. They allowed this to happen. And then they really stonewalled when it came to revealing information. So, just to kind of wrap up in this and get to some of your questions, the principles here around doing this work that are really important is, the first thing, again, if this environment is so easily manipulated, if you're going to do this work, you have to have your guard up. And I think this is true for all of us who are consuming content. You have to have your guard up and understand how things can be manipulated, and pause as you're reading things and recognize if you're, instantly believing it or instantly disbelieving it. But journalists in particular, we have to question things in the information environment. We can't just be taking information handed to us by so-called, disinformation researchers or experts, because then sometimes we end up passing along information that is not good and is not qualified and wasn't done in a responsible way. And journalists also have to understand that we are a target. We are a target because bad actors and disinformation agents want us to amplify their stuff. If they can get us to write about it in a way where we're treating it as real, then they have won, right? Because our credibility has now been used to launder this false or misleading information. And we have to understand that to guard against that. But as journalists, we also have to be strategic about what we cover in this area, because if there's something out there that's a false claim, but hardly anyone has engaged with it, is it really worth us spending our time to debunk something and risk maybe exposing more people to something they had never seen by telling them, hey, by the way, this thing is false, when they never actually saw it in the first place? In terms of approaches, this element in this example I gave you, started with me searching and just constantly looking. That is kind of what the daily work looks like. You are constantly trying to look across topics, across platforms, to see activity, to see what's going on, to track things. You still have to talk to people, have to develop sources, as you saw in that, Nigeria story. And the other thing that's really important is that, the content that was being produced and published by the Macedonian guys was indistinguishable, those false claims, from some, dedicated American, heavily partisan actors who were trying to support Trump with the same kinds of claims. And so if you looked at them, the claims could be the same. Pope endorses Trump. Macedonians loved it because it got engagement. Pope endorses Trump. A dedicated Trump supporter might have created that because they thought it would, help, bring people to him. And so the content can look the same, but for completely different reasons, right? And that's an important thing to know. And the last two things is, it's really important to think about not just like who the bad actor is, but who they are targeting. A lot of times, the inequalities that exist in our society are sort of exacerbated by disinformation. People who are already marginalized are often targeted with disinformation. And so talking about the victims of it, and so people can understand the toll and the cost and who is being targeted, is really just as important as trying to figure out who's behind it, because there are targets and there are people whose lives are affected by this. And then finally, as I think shown in that last example, the element of the role of these big tech systems, big tech companies in this environment, what they're doing well, what they're falling down on, what they will disclose and what they won't. These are things that are really important to bring out and to hold them accountable as well, because they are big and powerful organizations, and they are making hugely impactful decisions about what content they leave up and what content they take down. And there can be, implications of allowing harmful, hateful things to spread and affect people. And there are also implications if they are too quick to remove things and stifle free speech. And with that, pardon me, you know, I'm going to make these slides available, but, you know, if you are interested in this stuff, I have 2 resources here for you, which, you know, you can take a photo of this slide to have these links here for you, or as I say, I'll make the slides available. But the free verification handbook is there on the left, and it has chapters and case studies if you want to understand more about how this work is done. And on the right is kind of a Google Doc I maintain with lots of resources and tips and things like that that you can use if you actually want to dig in and do this work. And you know, the most important thing is whether you're a journalist who wants to learn these skills and apply this. The fact is, we all need to understand this context about our information environment, how easily it's manipulated. And even just understanding that element of bias and understanding that people are trying to manipulate us, to pause, to not pass things along right away, to think about them, to think about your reaction. If everybody did that just as a starting point, that would really help push back against some of the unfortunate elements of what can be at times a wonderfully democratized and open information environment. And so thank you for that. I would love to take some questions and have some discussion and hear from all of you now. I will also drop a link to the slides in the chat as well.
Check. There we go. All right. So does anyone have any questions? I'll walk the microphone around to you, though there are microphones in the ceiling too. Yes? All right.
You should be able to just stand up and speak, actually, because there's a mic right in the ceiling.
Yeah.
Should I stand or? Oh, okay. Okay, so if there's bias and misinformation and fake news on both sides and all of this misleading stuff around every single corner, do you ever feel fully satisfied with what you're putting out there? Or is there always kind of that little voice in the back of your head that says, what if this is false too?
Yeah, look, I mean, the first part of it, ever fully satisfied? I think probably not, because of course, whatever you do, it's just a small piece of it, right? And so maybe you do one thing and you think, well, that's a good story, but think of all the other stuff you didn't get to. At the end, inevitably, journalists think about how the stories we put out could have been better. So I think you do have to have a certain level of constant dissatisfaction to try and push yourself to do better, and also to not get too arrogant and full of yourself, because that's a great way to go about making mistakes. And then in terms of the second part, worrying about falling for something, worrying about putting something out there that's fake. I mean, that is the stuff of nightmares for me. Can you imagine spending more than a decade of your career thinking about this stuff, and then you get caught?
But it's good in the sense that, you don't want to be overtaken by fear, and you don't want to be overtaken by a sense of dissatisfaction, but you should have your antenna out, and you should never get so overconfident that you think you can't get got, that you can't fall for something, that you can't make a mistake. And I think it's really important as a journalist to find the balance between that healthy paranoia and that element of checking and the never being satisfied piece of it, while still actually being able to put stuff out there so that it's not paralyzing.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks for your talk today. You mentioned the examples of the folks in Macedonia and Trump things, and those were kind of maybe you thought fringe elements. But what about the situation we have with the Russian probe from 2016, and now the Durham report releasing court documents showing that a Clinton campaign lawyer went to the FBI with falsified records to trigger it, and the fact that that's almost 2 or 3 years old. And then they also have the Hunter Biden notebook issue, where it was written off as fake news, and now both mainstream organizations with formerly had excellent reputations now admitting that in fact that information was true. How do you handle that when the New York Times and the Washington Post falls on their face?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that I tried to make as a point is that, there can be a difference between one side or another at any given time of maybe who has more of false information than another. But the reality is we are all susceptible, and that includes journalists, right? So let's take the Hunter Biden laptop example. That came out, and one of the things that happened was Twitter, as a platform, said, "Oh, we think this is hacked material," and they tried to make the New York Post remove a tweet with a story written about it, right? And so that's a case where, and Twitter later admitted this, but they made a really bad wrong call, right? They decided this looked like the kind of a hacking operation, leaking like we've seen in the past, and we don't want hacked information spreading on our platform. And they made a call to basically restrain a news organization. And you also look at the reaction from other, mainstream news organizations to it. And a lot of them at the time, I didn't see them saying, well, this is 100% fake. I did see some journalists, I think, irresponsibly speculating, say, well, this looks like a Russian operation. Where is this really his laptop? And I think that was obviously wrong. You shouldn't be speculating. You should actually be saying, can I get my hands on the laptop and actually figure out what is going on with this data and dig into it? And so I think there were definitely some serious mistakes made by, one, Twitter, and two, by individual journalists, and then three, by news organizations around that, who chose not to cover it right away and treat it seriously. And so I think, there's valid concerns about that. And I think, you look at the Russia investigation, let's be clear, like, people have gone to jail as a result of that. There have been indictments of Americans and also Russians around it. So there were legitimate things that happened around that, but also there was a lot of overheated coverage as well. I remember seeing, I don't watch a lot of cable news, but there were, talking heads on cable news basically making it seem like, Trump was going to be arrested at any moment, right? And if you were watching those channels and getting that, you would have had a warped view of what was really going on. And so, the sort of question is, well, what about that stuff? I mean, look, there's a lot of valid criticism and complaints about how coverage has been done in those areas. And there's absolutely, I think, one of the things that happened is with Trump's election, I saw way more, false, misleading stuff spreading more virally on the left than before his election. I think a lot of people, when Trump got elected, they were ready to believe anything about him. And so there were claims about him that I would see propagating among, left-leaning websites and what have you, that prior to the election wasn't as bad, but suddenly once he was in power, it sort of made a lot of people more receptive to that. They would believe anything, and there were at times news organizations who would cover stuff and write stuff. And so for me, I think it's, it is a lesson that given the context, given the information, given who you are, you may be susceptible to false or misleading information and taking that in. It's something, personally, I try to remind myself all the time. None of us are immune to this stuff. And just because you're a professional journalist doesn't mean you're immune to it. In fact, that's where a lot of the big risk is that people who enter the profession sort of think, well, I'm a journalist, so I'm treating all information rationally. I'm doing the best I can to get facts, and not thinking about the fact that, we still have things in our brains and, our views and things like that can affect the way we do our work. And we have to be aware. Otherwise, we just go on autopilot. And I think that's when we make a lot of mistakes.
Thank you. That was a great question. We've got two more here. I'll grab the one in the front and then the fellow in the back.
So in your opinion, if our current information environment were to be left to its own devices, do you believe that we would ever see a day in the future where we no longer, as citizens, see the whole truth from even legacy news outlets?
I personally, if it's sort of left as it is, I don't know that we get to that point. I would say, one of the risks in this is not being proportional about it. Like if we look at what the studies have shown about 2016, how many Americans actually engaged with 100% false information on Facebook? Compared to the whole population, it's a smallish percentage, which is good news, right? But at the same time, I don't want to to minimize it to the point of saying, well, it's not an issue at all. And so I do think, there's things that would be nice to see them improved. I would like to see the platforms be required to be more transparent about the decisions they make about what to leave up and what to take down. I would like to see them sharing more data so that we can actually do better analysis to know the pervasiveness of false, misleading information. The studies that have been done, it's like the best we can do, but we don't have all the data that they have. And so
I take this stuff seriously, but I also wouldn't want to seem overly alarmist and say like, no one will know what to believe if, in 3 years, if we don't, make radical changes. I think there are still, people doing good work, putting out good information all the time. But the reality is nobody is perfect. No news organization is perfect. We talk about legacy news organizations. I mean, there's lots of them who do excellent work, but that doesn't mean everything put out every day is perfect and accurate. And if we don't actually take this seriously in our own newsrooms and work to make that better, then that's a problem. But I also think, yes, in the environment, if these platforms aren't better at dealing with, mass manipulation campaigns, forget about false and misleading. Let's talk about, people creating fake accounts, harassing people, trolling people, using social media manipulation to make things seem more serious than they are. Those are things that, the conversation often sometimes forgets, and they can be tremendously impactful. So I guess I'm more optimistic than maybe, thinking that we'll get to that extent, but I would like to see us take it seriously, but also not be in a crazy panic where we don't actually take reasonable, good steps. And the last thing I'll add on that is, we have to be careful what we wish for. If we want the platforms to be better at this stuff and to crack down, we also need to be careful that, they don't become, the most dangerous censors ever known to man. And some people already feel like they're at that point, which is why I think more transparency is needed. But, legislation wise and things like that, we need to be careful about, potentially emboldening more censorship and making the situation for free speech worse. This is the balance we have to strike, and that's the tricky part, I think.
Yeah, so my question kind of goes off of that, and that is, what do you know what the mechanism is that like verifies that the fact checkers that like Facebook and those companies use are in fact legitimate and unbiased and not partisan themselves? Because they've always seemed like kind of a shadowy, you don't really know who the fact checkers are. And some of them have seemed partisan to me in the past.
Sure, yeah. So let's talk about specific to kind of the Facebook program. All right, so as I said in the talk, this started at the end of 2016 where Facebook decided it wanted to have these, what they call third-party fact checkers, meaning they don't work directly for Facebook, although Facebook does, help fund the work they do, but they're not Facebook employees. And so what Facebook did was it went to an organization called the International Fact Checking Network. So this was a body that existed before this, where fact checkers around the world, of which there weren't that many at that time. This was a nonprofit organization that was basically helping them, figure out their best practices for doing their work, establishing standards of what they should be doing. So that's the IFCN, the International Fact Checking Network. And the way that it worked with Facebook was Facebook went to the IFCN and said, we need to figure out how to find credible fact checkers to work with in order to help evaluate content on our platform. And so the IFCN came up with basically a process to evaluate fact checkers. So fact checkers apply to the IFCN to basically get accredited. And I don't know 100% of all the ins and outs of the process, but I know what they have to do is they have to, submit samples of their work. They have to submit who their funding is, what that funding is. They have to submit who works for them, the credentials of the people who work for them. And then there are a body of kind of assessors who review the work, who review the financial information, et cetera, and then determine whether this is an independent fact-checking organization doing, verifiable work, meaning, again, are they perfect? No, but when they do their fact-checking work, do they actually show how they arrived at their assessment? And do they show their work enough, or are they just out there saying, well, this is false, and not giving a reason why? And that's really at the core of fact-checking is, regardless of who you are or who funds you, when you produce your fact check, can you back up what you're saying? And so, the short answer is, who is assessing them, who is evaluating them? It's the International Fact Checking Network. They use a system of assessment. They require them to sort of go for renewal and review. I don't know if it's annual or every 2 years. And those folks, get sort of an IFCN seal of approval, and they have events and trainings. And full disclosure, I have done trainings for IFCN members on how to do verification work for images, social media accounts, and that kind of thing. I'm not a member myself, but I do help do trainings for them. And look, at the end of the day, fact checkers are human. They're journalists, they're human.
They will make mistakes. We bring our own life experience and our own views to the work. But the way that you should think about, evaluating whether you have confidence in their work is to read it very closely. And when you're seeing a fact check, to say, well, what evidence do they have? What are they bringing here? Are they citing, credible statistics? Are they choosing sources that, don't seem very credible in and of themselves? If you can't get enough information from a fact checker on a specific fact check, to see how they arrived where they arrived, whether you end up agreeing or not, then that to me is a big red flag. They need to be showing their work. They need to be explaining their process and the evidence that they have brought to bear to come up with that evaluation. And that is their assessment. And it should be rooted in verifiable facts. But, there are times when things are kind of tricky to actually make a decision on, and you may end up disagreeing with them. But that's sort of, the general scenario of it, of how they sort of get accredited, how they end up in that program. And there are, they're now in more than 80 countries around the world. They try to sort of share best practices with each other. My experience is they are well-meaning people, but that doesn't mean, just like with me, the work they do is perfect and they don't make mistakes. It absolutely happens.
Thank you, Craig, for a great talk. I know, but we're going to hit the room first. This is why we ask people to come to an event. Okay. My students, bless their hearts, who are not journalists and they're not studying journalism, sometimes like to argue that as consumers of news, you just simply have to verify everything yourself. And so given, the case study that you just delineated for us, I'm wondering how feasible that is, because my concern is twofold. In the first place, the rabbit hole is the rabbit hole. So that, where do you stop verification? And second, I would say there certainly are longstanding reputable news organizations that maybe I would critique from a political economic perspective. But at the same time, I would say that it's precisely because of these professional norms and practices that they can be relied upon in terms of verification and fact checking and the things that you've been talking about. And that is most of the time, even though they make mistakes, they'll make mistakes. But most of the time, arguably, they can be relied upon because they have what Yochai Benkler his team calls the reality check mechanism, the folks from the Shorenstein study. And so I'm just wondering, can we not rely for the most part on these credible sources? Or does this run the risk of concentration of news ownership more than it already is?
Yeah, I think this is a key thing is like how much can or should we expect the average person to have to take on right now? Because I do think, the previous media environment, the thing that was nice about it, and I'll say the downsides in a second, but the thing that was nice about it is like it seemed very orderly. You would maybe have your local newspaper, there's some national newspaper, you'd have your TV news, and it was sort of like you sort of had a sense, okay, there's professionals working here, and they packaged this nicely for me, and I can overall trust it, and that felt good for a lot of people. The downside, of course, is that there was a limited number of voices, and the way that decisions were made in newsrooms, who was making the decisions, what is the culture of that newsroom, and they're deciding in very big ways what information people get or don't get. And so today you have just a fantastic menu of options, right? And you can pull from that, and you can have information flying at you constantly on your phone if you want that. And that's wonderful, except that not every, very few of us actually want to have to go through that amount of work to sift through it. And having all of that information actually does not necessarily lead you to be more informed. If anything, it could make you just feel like you're completely, decentered from everything and not know where to come from. And so what I would say is, I think for the average person, the big thing is number one, awareness of, look, it's an environment where manipulation happens, where there's so many sources coming from different perspectives. It's not all coming from professional journalists with ethics, which, as you said correctly, doesn't make them perfect, but it means that they're rooted at least in some professional practices, and that does raise the bar a certain amount. And so if you have the awareness that what you're encountering could be coming from any number of sources produced in any number of ways, and you are willing to sort of pause and not leap right away. I saw this thing, I'm going to believe it right away. Awareness and pausing and just having a little bit of patience are two of the most important things you can do. And then the third is to just think about seeking other sources out. And so if you see something online and it comes from a place you're not familiar with, this may be a great opportunity to go to some of those news sources you usually consult and just sort of see if they have anything about it. It may be a good opportunity to search, in Google News, which aggregates tons and tons of news sources of all types, and see what information is there. And so, the idea that every person will sort of forensically read every single article and extract from that is not reasonable to expect from us. And who wants to do that except for a weirdo like me, right?
And it's my job to do that. And so I think these really human things of just, being aware of this environment, it does put a little more onus on you, but hey, there's lots of sources now, and that can be good for what you're looking for. Pausing, don't feel like you need to make your mind up right away and share it right away, and just looking elsewhere to find stuff. And I do think that overall, legacy media outlets, do they do a good job overall? Are they professional overall? Yes. But listen, different outlets have different strengths and weaknesses. Different reporters have different strengths and weaknesses. And so I think it's good to be aware of that too. And this is where compare and contrast is really helpful. I don't ever give anybody a list of news organizations and say, here are the good ones and ignore everybody else. Because what really matters is how you are able to sort of sift through this environment and find stuff and evaluate it in a way that's reliable. And that's not about, partisan this or partisan that. It's about really, what is the claim? What is the evidence for it? Can I find other places and see what they're saying and make a judgment about, where this sits right now? And I think those are the things hopefully people will take away from it. Not good news orgs here, bad news orgs there, but just, you don't have to be a forensic scientist on this, but you probably do need to make a little more effort these days.
Thank you. Question right here. No? Any other questions in the room before? All right.
My question would just be, do you have any thoughts about the problem where a news story will go viral, but then later there's a correction, but then people have already seen the article and then they don't see the correction?
I mean, dude, that was my whole 2015 research paper. Like, not that I would expect you to read it, but I mean, is this a problem? Yes, this is a huge problem. I mean, and this is where hopefully like people see I'm willing to be critical of my own profession, right? Is like, this is what we documented because I could see that it was a problem, right? But seeing it and documenting it and putting in the face of people in journalism so that they might do something about it are two different things. And so what we absolutely saw when we did that research back in 2014 was that when, there's a claim that's out there that especially has potential to get attention and traffic, right? You would see news organizations writing it up pretty quickly. And sometimes they would write it up in a way where they sort of made it clear, like, we don't know if this thing is true or not, but it's a claim and it's out there and we just want you to know about it, which in and of itself has its own ethical debates, right? But then later on, whether it's hours or days or weeks, especially if the timeline is longer, the chances that they would ever go back and update or correct that article start to really diminish, okay? And we would see when we measured the social engagement that the stuff got its most engagement in those early, hours or, day or two where the claim was fresh and nobody knew if it was true or not. When it ended up getting debunked, nobody cared in the media. Like, it didn't get covered as much. And so this is where, that excerpt I sort of read from the report is like, this is a situation where you were actively misinforming your audience. You are accountable. If you are going to choose to cover something early on, you are accountable for coming back to it and making people aware that the status of this information, has now been determined and hey, it was true or hey, it was false. So it is a big problem. And, just to compare to the way things used to be, if you were a newspaper reader, and you read something that was incorrect and the newspaper realized it, like a day or two later, tucked into like page A2 would be a correction at the bottom saying, hey, this story from 2 days ago, 3 days ago turned out to be incorrect. We regret the error. And this was literally the way that newspapers dealt with this for hundreds of years. The earliest correction I found was, I think it was 1690 in Massachusetts. And that also had its flaws, right? Because how do you know that the person who read the article 3 days ago is going to look at the correction page now? And so this has been a challenge we've always had. But the thing with the digital environment is you actually have a better chance of getting it out to people. Like, you could maybe tweet the correction. You could actively re-promote the article now that it has been corrected and fixed.
but these are not yet widespread best practices. And so, yeah, it's a big problem. It's something that, I still to this day, I want to bang my head on my desk that we don't do a better job of it. And it's a dynamic. The one thing I will say that's improved is, when we did the research in 2014, the idea of like viral news and big websites jumping on any claim that anybody said on Twitter, it was like a pretty big problem then. I do feel like the standards have elevated a little bit, and I don't see that hunger for viral news as much. And I think part of that is those articles usually performed really well on Facebook, and Facebook in general is sending less traffic to news organizations. So the spigot has kind of turned off, and they've sort of awoken from that time and don't do that as much. But yeah, it's a problem. It's still a problem. Maybe not as bad as before, but still drives me nuts, as you can tell from my reaction.
And if you want to learn more about that, you should read his book, Regret the Error.
Thank you. I didn't even pay him to say that. Look at that.
We're going to take one more question from the chat here, and then we'll be wrapping up.
Okay, so on the chat, it says, it's kind of in two parts. Can you please comment on the problem that refuting bad info with fact checking sometimes produces? And that's a response that is fake news. Do we need some kind of certification of fact checkers, which you kind of went into? And then below that, the clarification, I'm thinking here about the war in Ukraine. People are making and sharing videos on the ground. This seems to be crucial information with enormous potential, yet it is difficult to claim that these are fact. This raises for me the possibility that real facts might not qualify as fact, and it is very disturbing in trying to develop a response to the horrors of what is happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, so the response of people to fact checking is something that fortunately is being studied now because there's so much fact checking and because academics are paying more attention to this area. And, I would say it's kind of still, it's not a solved and answered question. But one of the things that I will say that I think is definitive is that we have to be realistic about what we can expect from fact checking. And I say this to fellow journalists all the time. The idea that like a single fact check is going to change someone's mind on a topic that they, have very strong feelings about is like basically impossible. That's not going to happen. Fact checking is not there to change deeply held beliefs and change people's minds. That's a process that does someone's mind need to be changed? Let's be humble about that. People can have their points of view, but also, if we're realistic about it, I'm like, yes, the reaction from some people is kind of a blowback thing at times, where the fact that a fact checker has checked it and said it is false makes them actually suspicious in that moment, because, they may be someone who over time has come to not trust fact checkers, right? They have decided that, I don't like the work they do. They continue to check things that I believe are true. And that person has developed, an antipathy towards fact checkers. I don't think that's widespread. And the data that's out there right now suggests that, on topics where, again, somebody doesn't have a deeply held belief, if they're not already predisposed to not like fact checkers, they are open to reading a fact check and considering it, which I think is what, we would all like to have happen. At the very least, be open to reading something and considering it. And so I think that there is some encouraging data that fact checks can absolutely have an effect on people. When we talk about a situation like Ukraine, this is a place where, people can have very deeply held beliefs, right? And if we talk about footage coming out of a war zone, this is where, I would encourage people just overall to be very patient and cautious about this stuff, because like the example that I gave you very, very early on, of the warship video of the warship exploding and people saying, hey, this is what happened with the Russian warship today in Ukraine. That stuff is rampant, and it is always rampant in war zones. Some people are deliberately doing it, but a lot of people are well-meaning and passing it along as misinformation, right? And so I think with the Ukraine stuff, there's a lot of really important, urgent things coming out of it right away. But unless you're a person who is spending time being very systematic about looking at this footage and considering it, you're probably in a tough position to make good calls on it. And I do think this is a place where some of those visual investigations teams who specialize in this stuff are really good. And I would pay attention to the places that are well staffed up and that will show you their work is always a big thing. Will they show you the videos they found, how they made the decisions? I don't trust people who just tell me, here's what the verdict is. I need to see the evidence and see the result. And that's what journalists need to do. So look, I mean, there is the blowback element for some people with fact checkers. They see the label on Facebook and, you know, they believe it anymore because they feel like it's like an institutional view that is pushing back on them. And I think for fact checkers, there is good encouraging data that the work can have an effect. But I also think fact checkers, and I'm going to see a bunch of fact checkers at an event in a couple months, you know, we have to think about how people doing this work can make their work more trustworthy, can explain more about how they go about their work, who funds them, how do they approach their jobs? Because I think that, you know, there can be misperceptions that come from a lack of information, a lack of transparency. And, you know, a bit more transparency might be helpful. And also, you know, the platforms like Facebook doing more testing to see what is actually the best way to display a fact check on Facebook. That's data we don't have and don't know. Putting a label on it, when someone shares something and they see their post has been labeled, that bothers a lot of people, right? And so I hope that they're doing some, you know, testing at Facebook to figure out other approaches to make fact checks just more, not necessarily that people accept them blindly, but that people are willing to read and consider them. I think that's what we should ask for, not necessarily that it's going to instantly change people's minds, because people should be free to read them and decide how good they are.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing your time and experience with us. Let's give them another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the questions and discussion. It's been great.
All right. Now I'm going to pass this back over to Sue for some closing.
That closes our series of speakers for Bad Info. Thank you for joining us and enjoy your evening.
Students, I got papers for you.
Thank you again, Craig.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good luck on your papers, students.
Layton, I got yours.
The white hair.
Tyler, Chloe, Benjamin.
Here.